let's start right in with a dietary question that we've had from somebody. The question is it common that children that are following a specialized diet, in particular avoiding foods known to affect behavior, learn and benefit better from an ABA therapy program?
Yes. I don't know if it's common, but we definitely have seen some of our children do much better. Some of the foods, I mean, that's a really good question, actually, because some of our kids, once we get them on, let's say, a casein limited diet or a no casein diet, they amazingly wake up, pay attention. It's almost as if, I mean, it's similar symptoms to having allergies, you know, and when you immediately see when they're off of casein, they don't have dark circles anymore, and they're just more aware. Gluten is even more significant, I think, with some of our kids, and we have data actually on this where we have been tracking a child's acquisition, and then the child will start on in about 3 weeks or a month on a gluten casein-free diet, will show significant growth, like their whole trajectory of acquisition changes. So there's no question that some children absolutely benefit. But the question is asking sort of about, I think it said something about foods that are shown to improve behavior, and that
they're avoiding foods that, in this particular child, have shown to affect their behavior.
Their behavior, right. And that, of course, could also be soy with some children. It could be corn with some children. It could be red dye in some foods for our children. It could be sugar as a whole. I mean, what we're trying to avoid with sugar is not only that, of course, sugar has these, you know, up and down sort of energy bursts that sometimes with our kids that's not so good because they really become very hyperactive. But it also is, what we're trying to avoid is in some children who have fungal issues, it becomes extremely important to not feed the fungus. And so the concept with this gluten the same is just to make sure the diet is absolutely right for the child, and that is not necessarily the diet that we all have.
Right. And you're singing my song here because, as you guys know, I have a child on the spectrum and he's very reactive to some foods.
Absolutely.
And we saw in his, it's so individual.
Oh yeah.
And I always think, you know, people talk about how if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism.
Right.
But as parents, I think it's important for us to realize that we need to recognize that in terms of our child's ecosystem, that each child is so different, what they can eat, what they react to.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think like even my own children, like I always have them on probiotics, simply because the food that we eat now in the US really doesn't give us exposure to the appropriate bacteria anymore. I mean, a lot of the food that we eat is genetically modified food. And so you do need the appropriate bacteria in order to be able to digest nutrition and nutrients. And then I also always give my kids cod liver oil or some form of fish oil, which is very important as well for brain functioning. So I think, you know, having a good diet that's appropriate for the child and then having the appropriate supplements, I think makes a big difference.
Yeah, and even I've heard you talk before about how important it is for if a child wants to learn, we want them to be as healthy as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes, you know, and actually that's a good segue into a whole different area, which is, you know, we tend to become so focused on the external symptoms of autism, you know, for instance, the delay in language or whatever else. And then we don't realize that our children sometimes are not healthy. They're having health issues that we're ignoring. You know, I have so many families that will tell me they're, you know, when they come to see me for intake, and they'll go into a long period of talking to me and describing how the child doesn't sleep, how he has maybe 8 to 10 bowel movements a day, diarrhea type bowel movements a day, how, you know, and then they'll go on and talk about the child being hyperactive, unable to sit still, unable to pay attention. And I just ask, okay, so if you didn't sleep and if you had diarrhea, you know, for months and months and 8 to 10 times a day, imagine how you would be feeling. And it's so important for us to stabilize the child's health before expecting the child to all of a sudden now benefit from a major amount of tutoring or instruction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, wonderful answer to that. This is a question I'm really excited to hear your answer on. Hi, Dr. Doreen. How and when do you say a child on the spectrum is high functioning?
Well, okay. That's also, very interesting. Well, I guess for me, it's, I don't like to use the term high functioning or low functioning because, first of all, I think all children are high functioning in different settings or environments, and I think that all the kids have they actually change their functioning level, like hopefully, right? I mean, otherwise we're useless. But I guess I would say that the number of symptoms that define where the child falls within the spectrum. So for instance, for a diagnosis of autism, you need to have 6 symptoms. And the symptoms could be things like, is not communicating with anyone else verbally, or also is lacking nonverbal communication skills like eye contact and so on, has repetitive rigid behaviors, is delayed in the social area. And if you have 6 symptoms with 2 of them being in the social area, you get a diagnosis of autism. And if you have 5, you'll get a diagnosis of PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So would you then say that the child with PDD-NOS is higher functioning than the child with autism? I'm not sure, because we're really talking about the difference of one symptom being there or not. So I don't think that I would go with that necessarily, but when you really look at it, I guess for me, it's pretty clear that the precursor to social skills is communication. So I sort of think that the diagnostic criteria have to address that as well, because if you have a lot of delays in the communication area, it's pretty inevitable that you're going to have delays in social as well. How are you going to interact? How are you going to socialize? It's going to make things much more difficult. So for me, the higher functioning kids are the ones where they have speech, and we're beginning to develop more advanced language concepts, and that will always lead to a social development. And I would say the kids who are more impacted by autism, I guess, are the ones that are not developing any form of speech. That tends to be harder. Now, having said that, some of my completely nonverbal kids are unbelievable once we get them on augmentative devices or the iPad or iPhone even now. The kids are just amazing, and then they just show what's inside, once they can communicate. So let's say any form of communication, if there is some connection with other people and with being able to communicate more than just needs, right? I mean, communicating needs, I think, is more of just a natural process. It's sort of like a response almost. But if you're able to communicate more, just anything about, like, showing a parent something or indicating that something that happened, those kids I consider to be either high functioning or definitely capable of becoming high functioning. It's hard. I mean, every child is so different. So I don't really like to label high or low functioning.
And I think everybody sort of hates the term. People have said before, isn't there some better term that we can come up with? And I know with the new diagnostic criteria that's supposed to come out next year,
this becomes a factor, the way that they're looking at it now is they've changed it from like the functioning level of the child to the amount of assistance the child will require. Which, makes sense, because the children who are more affected by autism obviously will need more assistance, an aid with them or so on. And the ones that are overcoming autism, I guess, would need a lower level of assistance. And that is a little bit better to look at it that way, I think.
Interesting. Very interesting. I think we should take a break.
Okay.
Give you a break, and we'll come back in just a minute more with Ask Dr. Doreen. Keep your questions coming. Welcome back to Ask Dr. Doreen. We're here with Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, truly a visionary in the field of autism. I'm so grateful to have time with you and have you be able to answer these questions. For those
I told you this is like my favorite part of the week because I feel like I'm doing something useful.
Mine too. Well, you do a lot of useful things, but I'm thrilled that you're able to be with us.
Thank you.
We had a question come in. Are there any studies or results of early intervention in how in the now adult with AS? How does this affect long-term intimate relationships? Will they be able to empathize and read their partner's emotions? Will they be able to have reciprocal communications needed to have this type of relationship? I think it's the core question that we all want to know: is my kid going to be able to have a happy relationship with another person?
Right, and what a fantastic question, because the answer to that question is, as far as I know, there are no studies to look at sort of adults who are now adults and their relationships and empathy and so on, if they received early intervention when they were children. I love that question because it actually gives me a really good idea on an area that we need to research.
Absolutely.
Having said that, I have a lot of adults who recovered with me when they were children. So I would say I have been involved with a lot of my adults who were with me, gosh, I guess maybe 20 years ago or so. And very honestly, if you do overcome the diagnosis when you're, let's say, 9, 10, 11, and so on, and if you are able to join the mainstream, then yes, those of my adults definitely do have relationships. I've been involved in their relationships, girlfriends, breakups, so on, boyfriends. And I really don't see anything different.
It's hard for everyone.
Absolutely, definitely. I would say though that, and people laugh at me when I say this, but I truly believe this. Our kids just, when they, our kids when they're little and they're just being affected by autism, and they go through very intensive, I guess, intervention, and they learn everything a little bit later than you typically would, and I guess they learn everything in a very, compact period of time, so it's a very intense period of time. I just think that our kids turn out to be better human beings, and I sincerely mean that. Because one of the things you see with them is that they're protected in the very early ages of life, and then we continue, of course, to protect them to some extent as they grow up and learn things. And there's a whole team of people explaining things to them and teaching them how to approach problems. Who has the benefit of, one of the things we do with our kids as they get older is we go heavily into the executive function curriculum, the cognition curriculum, and a lot of that is just explaining to the child how to problem solve and how to think about things like winning and losing, how to understand other people's feelings. These are things we teach. So I think the fact that our kids actually receive this in some form of structured instruction, they end up being just wiser and a lot, I guess, they're more analytic because they are thinking about their own stuff as well. And there's no question, they're just nicer people.
Absolutely.
They're sweeter, lovelier. And I'm telling you, Shannon, when you see them and they grow up and they're in their 20s, they're still the same. They're just lovely people. They never learn to do bad things, and it's amazing. You would think that a person like that would have a hard time going through life, but they don't. They're just the loveliest people. You've met some of the guys that work at CARD or Come and Go, and they're just amazing people. Several of my older kids or adults now do have relationships, girlfriends. One of mine is about to get married next year.
Sweet.
So it is very, very possible. Everything becomes just typical and even better.
I agree. You and I were both at an event last summer where 3 young men that you were instrumental in recovering spoke, and it was amazing. There was not a dry eye in the place.
That's right.
People were laughing and crying and standing up and cheering. And what was amazing that all 3 of those young men were working here for a period of time last summer, and so I got to know each one of them in a little bit.
That's awesome.
And what was really interesting to me is I would go to the elevator, and people are busy and they're in their heads and they're thinking. You have a lot of wonderful people who work here, and they're at the top of their game, but sometimes they're in their head thinking about how they're going to help a child.
Right.
But the most polite people at the elevator were those 3 young men. The kindest, and asking, how is your day? How are things for you? How is your son?
Absolutely.
And it was remarkable how polite they were.
No question. And, Shannon, tomorrow is Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Guaranteed I will get 3 different of my guys texting to say Happy Thanksgiving. They're just the loveliest people. They really, truly are.
Considerate. Really considerate.
Absolutely. Considerate, kind, just always sort of, because they've learned to pay attention to other people's feelings and emotions and all that sort of stuff, and happy, and they do very functional things to sort of engage themselves in life. So it's very
really
nice.
Remarkable.
And the same thing, if you remember when we at CARD we celebrated our 20th year. That was a couple of years ago. Our kids came up and as adults and gave speeches, and those were truly the most touching speeches, no question. These guys are amazing. I mean, how many other, let's say, 19 or 20-year-olds do you know who can get up in front of an audience of 500 people and just talk about their lives?
We have the clip that we show on Friday afternoons sometimes of Brett's speech, Brett Myler.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have to show it at the end on Friday because I can't speak afterwards because I'm so emotional.
No question.
And I always say, stop and consider that he is 19 at this point and speaking to a huge room full of very influential people that anybody else would be incredibly intimidated.
Right.
I don't know many 19-year-olds who could deliver a speech that funny, articulate, and make everyone in the room absolutely weep.
Absolutely, and just happy with themselves in the world. Yeah.
Oh,
it's wonderful.
Absolutely amazing. Very, very interesting. It gives me all kinds of hope as a parent.
Oh, definitely. No question.
But what a wonderful thing, though, to study, as you said, to study further to see what the relationships are like for these kids, because I think that would give people hope as well. Okay, I wanted to talk about, this is a question that cracks me up that came in. What is the thing with repeating 10 times the same answer? I had the same question when I was a parent and starting out with my son on ABA. Is it just for data collection? For example, they'll say, what does the cow say? The therapist keeps repeating 10 times, moo, moo. Isn't that rote teaching?
Right, mass trial. That's an intense question. How much time do we have to respond to that one? Because it's an important question.
It is.
Okay. So first of all, it's not necessary to do 10 trials. That's number one. You could also consider something mastered for a child just after 3 trials. It doesn't matter. You could also, the type of data that you take could be probe data. So you could just teach a child various concepts and then come back and probe and see if he learned those concepts. The concept with mass trials is to make sure that the child gets to a point of fluency with the topic, so that later on when other topics come in, the child doesn't get confused. So for instance, an example of that would be, okay, so this is, like I said, I'm trying to shorten my responses and not get into, I have 1,000 things to say to that. So let's say, as we learn normally, typical kids, you learn concepts and you have the time to classify them in your brain in different ways. So for instance, you might learn shapes, and as you're learning about shapes as a very small child, you might also learn that, most tables are rectangular. Okay, and then later on in life, you'll also see round tables, and you'll be like, okay, so you'll add on to it and say tables are round as well. Right. Okay, so that's called working memory. So what you're doing is you're adding to a concept, okay, and you're just making it a more complete concept. With our kids, kids, they don't really have time to allow their working memory to develop in that process. So they have to redefine what they've learned very rapidly, right? So today I might learn shapes, tomorrow I'll learn that tables are rectangular, and the next day I'll learn that, oh, tables are square and circular as well. And then I have to form a new concept which says tables can be rectangular or circular. Okay. And the process of just changing, excuse me, the rule you just learned is a very hard concept.
Yeah.
If when you learned about tables being rectangular, you're not firm on that, you're not really well, that's not well ingrained, then what tends to happen with a lot of our kids is they change the concept instead of adding to it.
Okay.
And even when we test our kids on standardized measures, working memory, which is the concept, the ability to be able to add and make your concept larger, is very low on a lot of our kids.
Wow.
And that's the reason that you want to make sure the first concept is very firm before you teach the second concept, because otherwise the second concept will replace the first. So now tables are all circular, and that's just confusing. Okay, so, and that's just one example. This happens across the board with everything. Now, when I say that, when you're very well trained, you will recognize that the child is beginning to get bored if you're repeating concepts. Every child is different. Some kids learn it in 3 trials. Some kids will need 20, 30 trials of something before they get it. But if you're repeating something, 10 trials, and you're not either prompting the child more or rewarding less or changing your procedure or something that makes the process more challenging, I guess, then a lot of the kids do get bored.
Right.
And when they get bored, or it's even more than bored, they get upset. Like, why are you repeating this? I already told you what the answer is.
Right.
And then they'll start to pay attention to other things, and then you've lost them because you're just becoming a drill sergeant now, and that's not what we want with our kids. So that really has to do with the quality of the therapy, and junior therapists often make that mistake, and the senior therapists and the supervisors are meant to really focus on that. When I look at our data, I've almost never see 10 trial sets anymore. Okay. So people are really doing 3 trials, 6 trials, they vary it based on the child.
Right. But also, correct me if I'm wrong, sometimes our kids need that though, don't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes, even teaching one concept, let's say a very basic concept like, touch pen, right? And I mean, I'll teach the child touch pen, and I can model it for the child, and the child will easily be able to put his hand on the pen. But then when I introduce other things on the table, then he might touch something else. Right. So that will require additional trials. Right. I mean, it's a very I guess structured process, and it's just important to keep the balance of the number of lessons or drills or SDs or instructional units equal to, or balanced out with the amount of reinforcer, the amount of breaks, making sure that you're keeping the child interested, because after all, you're teaching the child a huge amount of stuff. Right. And the worst thing is when you see a therapist who's not paying attention to any of that and is just, rotely
doing the telling.
So to answer this parent, it's absolutely possible for ABA to go wrong and become extremely rote, but it's not supposed to be that way.
Exactly, and I'm always talking about how important it is, especially now with more and more people getting ABA, to make sure you're getting quality ABA therapy. Because it is, I see, and I saw this with my child, you guys were very creative. It's very individualized for the child. Right. So there might be guidelines for 10.
It's just, I mean, and if you think about it, Shannon, when we first started to learn real basic concepts ourselves, let's say the alphabet. Right. It's all rote. Yes. In the beginning, it's all rote. Right. It's only after you can master the rote aspect of a concept that you can apply it and make it more abstract and less rote. So the basic stuff, and that's why our programs generally start with the discrete trial. And the discrete trial is pretty repetitive. It's not necessarily 10 trials, but it is pretty repetitive because at that phase of instruction, things have to be really, really firmly firmly learned and ingrained in the child before you can apply it to the natural environment.
Yeah, and I must say that as a parent, when we started, there wasn't as much information on the internet about ABA, but I knew enough, and I'd seen what had happened with other children.
Sure.
I knew enough to have buy-in, but I didn't get the full arc of ABA.
Right.
So in the beginning, when they were doing trials, I would frequently sit there and say, how is this all going to come together?
Right.
I didn't really get it, but it did, and it came together beautifully, and I refer to it as the autism miracle in my living room because it was amazing. And I always encourage people, if you want to see what the arc looks like, the A Word is a wonderful documentary,
it's true.
And you can see how something goes from that,
Absolutely
the trials to being generalized. It's amazing.
You're so right. I mean, when I think about it, we just don't think about these things because this is our life, right? We've been doing it forever, but you're so right. Like, as a parent, you're sitting there and thinking, so how is, teaching this child to, we just taught him to touch items or point to items, and now we're teaching him to give items. Like, how is all this going to help him speak in the future?
Yeah.
Because there's a million things that you teach individually and join to other things in order to produce the end result. It's a lot. Yeah, you're right.
And if you don't know,
it's like, how do these individual ingredients, it's kind of like how does butter and flour and all of this come together to make this incredible cake?
Exactly.
It is.
And it does. Yeah. It comes together. But until you've seen it, I often say, one of the things I love about the A Word is I feel like I've read the book before, but I get to go back and enjoy it now because I know the ending.
Right.
So in any case, if you want to know more about the arc and see it for yourself, you can do that for the A Word. And we're going to show that in just a little while. Okay, another question that's coming in on the live. When is the right time, interesting wording here, when is the right time to stop trying to teach a child to speak and to start on a communication device?
Great question. These questions are so good. We should write all these up somewhere.
Exactly.
Okay, so I always, if I'm starting with a child young, it's much harder for me when I'm starting with a child who's, let's say, past the age of 5 or something. Okay. That's really hard because I don't know what they have learned in the past. That it's very hard to tell what's the habits they've developed, all that. But let's assume I'm starting with a nonverbal child and they're young, like let's say 3 or so, then I will definitely be working on the development of speech sounds pretty intensely for the several years, but I'll be looking at the development of just imitation, echoics, within the first 6 months. And if I can develop some form of imitation of sound, then I am pretty sure I can produce speech. I can get the child to produce speech. Beyond speech is a whole different phase of what's language. And language is a little bit more complex than just basic speech. But if you continue to do work with a child for about 6 months or so and they're not developing any kind of echoic, being able to imitate sounds, then there are a few other things I guess I would do before giving up on that. I would definitely want to look at the child's hearing. That becomes a very important issue because, we started to develop, Shannon, all of our nonverbal programs back many years ago, and it was because we started to realize that our children are not even hearing these sounds properly, and so it means nothing. I mean, one of my actually recovered kids told me a long time ago that was one of the wonderful things that you get by talking to your older kids or adults. He said that the sound of speech was a very distant background noise, and there were many other sounds that were much more pervasive for him, like doors opening and closing, those types of things. So it was very hard to concentrate on speech sounds, which is fascinating, right? Which takes us back to the whole concept of sensory and how that affects our learning. But so what I do is if I work with a child, let's say 3 to 3.5, or even 2.5 to 3, for 6 months and I'm trying to get the imitation of sound and I can't, I would definitely want to get their ears checked, and then I would want to also look at apraxia, you know, the what's going on in their mouth in terms of their movement of the tongue. Are they even able to produce some of these sounds? I might back up and start working on what we call pre-verbal skills. So, you know, movements of the tongue, being able to actually put the tongue out, up, down, and all that, and then see if that affects speech. So, you know, I'd work on the ABA concepts of speech about 6 months. Then I do some kind of remediation type stuff, you know, figure out if he's hearing okay, figure out if he's able to produce sound okay. And if none of that worked, so that would be like the first 6 to 12 months of intervention, maybe even 6 to 9 months. At that point, before the child starts to get more frustrated, I would switch over to augmentative device, or a PECS program or any kind of nonverbal program, but I would continue to pair vocal with it. So, and the reason for that is that I want to make sure my child learns some form of communication fast, because once the kids are able to communicate, all their behavior issues go down.
Right.
Because they're now communicating, you know.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm still not ready, because I'm thinking maybe the communication aspect, the visual aspect of an AUG device or a a PECS program or something will actually help their language, and it sometimes does.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just kickstarts the verbal. And if not, like I said, after trying all those things, we can do almost all of our programs with our kids non-verbally. I mean, and you basically will now, at that point, you'll pick whether you want a picture exchange type program or if you want to go to sign language or whatever area of communication. But it's very important to move forward and teach the child communication even if they're non-vocal.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. I got another question here about engagement, keeping our kids engaged. Hi, Shannon. My question for Dr. Doreen is about keeping our kids engaged. I try to keep my 10-year-old mainstream son engaged with appropriate play. There are times, though, that I just don't have it in me, and while I'm taking a break, I'm feeling totally guilty that my child is perseverating and just what I call doing his numb trance. A mother's guilt, how to get rid of it. We all feel the guilt,
right?
My gosh,
yeah.
And yet, you know, you're all doing a great job. We were dealt a different hand, and we show up. And, but in terms of this, keeping them engaged.
Right. You know, it's amazing because with my own kids, you know, I sometimes think like, oh gosh, I just need to go lay down for half an hour, but what are the kids going to do? And I need to go do something with them and keep them busy. And when you have a child on the spectrum, of course, your behavior program specialists are telling you need to keep him engaged all the time. You need to not allow him to self-stimulate or do all these other things. And it is a 24/7 type thing. And a lot of our behaviorists, I tell them, you know, don't be tough on the parents. You don't know until you have your own child how hard this is. Honestly, the right answer to this is get some help, because I don't think it's possible for parents to keep the kids engaged or not drifting off all the time. I just don't think it's possible. You're a human as well, and you know, you need to get some help. These are the circumstances where respite type respite workers are useful, because you can actually train other people. You can even train, you know, like let's say high school students in your neighborhood or family members or something like that, just so you can have a little bit of time of rest. Now, having said that, it really depends on the types of things your child is into and not into. Like a lot of times I tell the parents, any other behaviorists will say, they told me I can't allow my child to do any computer programs because they tend to drift off or become obsessive about it or whatever, and they're supposed to engage with humans all the time. I don't agree with that. My feeling is that everything should be allowed to the kids as long as it's in moderation. So if you have a child who actually does become completely closed out to the whole world when they're watching TV or when they're engaged with a computer, then that should actually occur so you can work on that. So in other words, I mean, that you should let the child get on the computer a reasonable amount of time and, you know, make sure that it doesn't become 10 hours a day.
Right.
But at the same time, having the child engage with, let's say, educational programs on the computer or even games on the computer, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a reinforcing activity for most of our kids, and it can also be highly educational. I mean, I used to use a bunch of these with my kids when they were little. And at the same time, it gives you a slight break. It gives the child rewards during the time frame, and there's nothing wrong with it. You do not have to 24/7, you know, have the child engaged in conversation or in social or whatever it is. If the child is not interested in various play activities or toys, then the behavioral program can teach the child certain things that they're interested in. Some of our kids become interested once you hit the programs having to do with arts and crafts, drawing. Some of the kids don't like to engage themselves at all with drawing, but they love music. It's really the same thing with our typically developing kids. It's just a matter of, yeah, you need to have more time because the child requires more time, but you need help for that.
Absolutely. And you know, you have in your curriculum a set of skills for independent play and teaching them to transition from one activity to another. And I remember when Jem was taught that, it was life-changing to us. That I literally had time to do my hair again.
Absolutely.
And I knew that he was doing something beneficial.
Yeah, when you have a child who's already now mastered a few toys, let's say, and they're interested in them, then it's very easy for us to, let's say, building blocks, you know, or puzzles or any other thing, and you just produce a board, you know, a visual schedule for the child, and you put these pictures of the activities and you lay out the activities in stations, and the child transitions based on a timer. So, you know, the timer will beep every 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and the child easily knows, oh, okay, it's time for me to go look at my schedule, see what's the next toy. And that sort of thing can go on for half an hour, 40 minutes, and that is really good for the kids to be able to sort of alternate their activities. But in some cases, you know, you have to actually teach the child things that they are interested in. Because let's remember, play is supposed to be reinforcing, 100% reinforcing, right?
Yeah, but it isn't always in the beginning for our kids.
No, it isn't, because the kids actually don't really, well, you know, let's say a child is completely fine with us socially if a child takes a car and like takes the car around a track, but it's not really fine if the child takes the car and is twirling the wheels repeatedly. So the whole, you know, what you're trying to do is you're bringing the child's play within the norm of let's say non-self-stimulatory behavior, which essentially means it's more of a socialized type of play. It's something that you could do with other children. It doesn't block your attention from the outside world, all of those factors. And then once the child has a few of those skills, then absolutely you can join them and increase the time period.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Okay, Dr. Doreen, will my child always be naive, innocent compared to his typical peers? I'm so worried about peers taking advantage of him as he moves on to mainstream 4th grade. This is an issue that we deal with a little bit right now.
Totally.
They get tough right around this age, the other kids, and I'm seeing it and feeling it a little bit. It's interesting.
Which goes back to the earlier question, the earlier thing I was saying about how our kids are just nicer. You know, and the truth is, yeah, they are nicer, so they sometimes do get bullied. You know, it's the same as kids, I guess, who are a little bit more, you know, interested in academics versus sports. I mean, there's always the kids that do tend to become a little bit more aggressive or assertive, and the ones who don't. we found that we had to teach our kids a lot of concepts. We added this actually to our social curriculum, a lot of concepts for them to be able to differentiate between assertiveness that is not aggressive in nature. So how to be able to protect themselves, how to be able to even differentiate if someone is laughing at me versus with me. You know, those are very important inferences that a child has to make. So sometimes our kids will misinterpret something. Other times you're looking at other kids just being mean, you know. And I wish, Shannon, that I had time. There was a school district that I used to visit a few years ago when I went to Arizona pretty frequently when we were opening our Arizona clinic. And it was I think it was Scottsdale. It was a fantastic district. They had several parents, moms, had put together an organization, and the organization's job was to educate other kids about autism. And they would go from school to school, and they would show videos and give the other kids some sense of understanding what it's like to take the world in as a child with autism. Very similar to some of the stuff that's going on right now all over the US. You know, there's a lot, big movement against bullying and in schools, and there's a lot of this sort of thing. And I wish that I had time, or a group of parents would get together and really develop that program. Actually, we've discussed it at ACT today to try to put together a youth program where some of our you know, teenage kids will go into schools and be able to like instruct the other kids. But it's just, that's just one of those things. It's you know, and our kids, if they can process it, if they can understand it, that these kids are perhaps making fun because they don't know any better, maybe it makes them feel better about themselves, you know, it's just a matter of like cognitively understanding that it really has nothing to do with you. I mean, kids unfortunately bully other kids to the point that they produce psychosis in other kids or suicidal behavior in other kids. So bullying as a whole is just not a good thing. And with our kids, they're just so sweet that they are exposed to that. Do they always, I think the question said, is this going to be forever? I don't think so, because I see that my kids do actually learn very well how to protect themselves and defend themselves, and they kind of, you know, gain an attitude to themselves a little bit later. But you know, it's almost sad to see that, because our kids are just so lovely and sweet, and you wish you just could change the environment.
But not always possible.
Not always possible.
And then we do, and you know, you guys have given us skills for my son to work on, so that he can not change who he is, not so that he doesn't have to become mean, but that he can cope a little bit with what kinds of things, and those cognitive skills that you were talking about, to think it through and decide. I actually think they're brilliant for all of us, because looking at why is this person behaving this way, does it actually have to do with me, or does it have more to do with them? And
that's also kind of part of the reason that I like my kids to have some I guess language ability and social ability before I put them in school, because you know, it is hard for our kids. You place them in school and we have these huge expectations of them, and if they don't have the tools to know how to react to what's going on in school, they're going to actually close in even more and, you know, self-isolate, because it's not going to be a pleasant experience.
Which absolutely, I think we have one comment here. Thank you so much. It's so with 3 O's. Dr. Doreen, for taking time with Shannon on Wednesdays to help so many. I truly appreciate both you and Shannon for your wisdom.
That's very nice.
And they said happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we have time for one more, but a quick one. Hi, Dr. Doreen. When and how do you decide if sensory integration would help the child in eliminating or managing automatically reinforcing self-stimulatory behaviors? And 2, does CARD provide sensory integration therapy? Thank you very much for an informative show. So,
okay.
I know, I gave you a couple of minutes.
No, I love that one, because I can't tell if it's probably a very, very you know, well ABA trained parents asking that, because they're referring to automatic reinforcement.
We talk about that all the time on the show. It's part of our jargon.
That's great. Okay. So the way that, and it's kind of a funny one. It's an interesting one, because, you know, everything we do, we get some form of reinforcement.
Yeah.
And it's not always from the outside, obviously. Right. So like a lot of times, you know, let's say a child will do well. Why do kids, let me just ask you this, why do our kids try to get better grades, right? When they're young. Yeah. A lot of times, the majority of the kids, like not in the third grade, you're not thinking about, I want to go to Harvard, you know? Right. You're thinking about, I like the feeling I get when my parents are proud of me. Yeah. That's pretty much what it is. Or later on, it might be, I like being the valedictorian because my peers think I'm really cool if I'm the best. Okay. So that's automatic reinforcement, right? Doing the thought process that keeps you going for that long, that's automatic reinforcement. But we don't use the term automatic reinforcement when it comes to those positive behaviors in ABA. We only apply the automatic reinforcement term to self-stimulatory behavior.
Interesting.
Why is that? The reason we do that is because we as behaviorists don't know why our kids are doing this. Let's face it, right? So why does a child line up objects? Why does a child, I don't know, you know, these, whatever, open and close doors, whatever it might be in the self-stimulatory realm. We refer to most of those things that we can't identify a function or a reason for. We call them, they are automatically reinforced. Okay, well, I kind of disagree with that. Okay. I think that there's always a reason we do things, and that's just the human body and the human being. Okay, so why, depending on the activities that the child is engaged in, you more or not, we can't always figure out what yet, because just we don't know enough about this field, but most of them, you can figure out what is the child seeking. It's just like communication. It's the same principles. When a child hits, you say, well, why is he hitting? He's hitting because he either wants something or he's trying to avoid something, right? And once we teach him communication, he can then ask for something or tell people to leave him alone, right? So the communication then replaces the hitting because it's more functional. Right. Okay. So now let's talk about self-stimulatory behavior. Why does a child try to, you know, sit there and sift sand for hours? Why does a child love to do this with water and look at it? Why does a child do whatever repetitive behaviors? Okay, that, and just because we don't know in the field of behavior analysis doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a reason for it. Right. So I've looked at all the self-stimulatory behaviors, and I think some of them, not all of them, but some of them you can definitely attribute to some cause. For instance, I know some of our kids, and you mentioned Brett earlier, and this was one of the cases with him, always used to look from the corners of his eyes or take his eyes to the side. Well, do you know, you know, a lot of our kids have deficits in central vision and they do better with peripheral vision. A lot of our kids actually are more focused, and they are focusing and trying to look, but they don't know how to focus. All of those types of, a lot of our kids who line up objects or get very upset if a certain routine is disturbed. All of this stuff we classify as self-stimulatory, right, or automatic. Those kids have anxiety, and they are gaining control. It's what we call obsessive compulsive behavior. They're gaining control by doing things in a very repetitive way, because repetitive process does not have any unknown. It's always repetitive. You know what's coming. They pattern. Right. They pattern because they know that this is the pattern. And it's just, a lot of our kids, it has a visual, sensory type of impact for them, which they enjoy, or a texture type of impact, which they enjoy. So for those kids, I feel, why not apply the same principles? Replace it with something that has a similar type of impact. So a lot of times with my kids who, let's say, are doing visual type of things, first of all, I'll put them in exercises for, you know, visual focus exercises, binocularity exercises, all those things that we've learned that will help improve their central vision. A lot of our kids who like to be able to pattern things in a very rote way, I will really focus on trying to give them a set of rules, some more order in their program, in their curriculum. And that goes to the heart of the concept of sensory integration.
Okay.
Sensory integration, of course, is teaching you to regulate your sensory, it's supposed to be. Like,
right.
Theoretically, what it does is it regulates your sensory needs, okay? So if a child has an increased sensory needs of one type, so that it is all-encompassing. It's either a visual or it's a tactile type thing or whatever it is. Sensory integration tries to balance that out by giving you activities in all areas so that you are now receiving sensory input across the board at an even amount, so that you don't necessarily seek out one particular repetitive thing. So does sensory integration affect that? I think it does to some extent. I don't know that we've been able to, there isn't a lot of research on sensory integration as a therapeutic technique. Theoretically, though, that's what it's supposed to do. Do I have kids that benefit? Yes, I do. I have kids who are extremely hyperactive, and as long as we slow down their intervention and actually break it apart with what we call a sensory diet and provide the child sensory input at regular intervals, we can control the child a lot better. Yeah. I have kids who will become extremely sleepy, and if we can do active sensory things with the child, like things that influence the child's pressure on the child's skin and so on, it will actually increase the child's energy level. No question about that. Yeah. How do we feel when we get a massage?
Yeah.
I mean, it does change your activity level. Yes, there's no question. Does. So that's sort of, I don't know if I want such a roundabout way, but I mean, it's like, I just feel that things that we label automatic are not necessarily automatic.
Okay.
So if the parents could try to figure out what's the child seeking in doing that, then there's a possibility of being able to replace it.